Okay, so we are live, lecture 24. Thank you everyone to join us for Tuesday's group discussion. Hopefully you have got a lot of valuable feedback and took good notes. That's going to be part of your milestone report. And also I'd like to thank you for the students who are here in person today. I think it's good to keep me company to some degree. All right, so today we're going to continue our discussion about clustering. And if you actually, Professor Analito talks about clustering-1. This is the second part of clustering, where our focus is talking about some of the distance metrics used for clustering, some of the known things about hierarchical clustering, DB scan, dendron diagram, and then the comparison of clustering methods. So I know a lot of people to some degree have worked with clustering, and clustering is both a science and an art. As you can see that, it's one of the things that is used across different fields. And then there's a lot of theory and algorithms and sort of practical rules people follow for applying for clustering algorithms. So there are some recommended reading that is listed here, especially for scikit-learn. The package itself has a number of clustering already implemented in there. So today we're going to first think about k-means clustering. The idea is if you're giving me some data and we would like to find some subgroups among the data, and those subgroups may not be known to us before, and we refer to those subgroups as clusters. And when I talk about clustering for this lecture, I really means what's called hard clustering, or sometimes referred to as a partition, meaning that for a particular data set, it only belongs to one of those clusters, and clusters don't intersect. But sometimes you might also be dealing with what's called soft clustering, where the clusters actually have shared elements. In other words, for some individual element, they might belong to more than one cluster, but that's not the focus for today's lecture. Okay, and clustering usually are considered in the case where you're grouping data points that are similar with one another in the same cluster. And then when they're in different clusters, when they are dissimilar, and they're actually used quite a bit, not just in computer science or math. It's also used specifically for things like social network analysis. You want to find communities. For example, if you have a bunch of players that play sort of a certain video games, you can kind of look at the player's profile and group them into different sub-communities. It's also used in ecology of looking at grouping sort of animals or plants into different groups of species. It's also, of course, used in genetics. And specifically, you're looking at gene expression and you want to cluster the genes that has a similar expression, which might imply similar functions. And of course, towards the end of today's lecture, we're going to talk about clustering of handwritten digits coming from MNIST data sets. So as I mentioned, there's many different clustering algorithms out there. We're only going to review a few of them today. So the one that's pretty widely used is called k-means clustering, where the k stands for how many clusters do you want. So just by the design of this algorithm, the first thing that comes to your mind is that this is actually a clustering algorithm that require a user-specified parameter. So the user provide what k is, and the algorithm is going to give you a k. Well, of course, in the next obvious question, is, well, what if I don't know how many clusters I really are there in my data? And that's a second algorithm we're going to look at, which is dbScan, where you don't specify a prior what is the number of clusters. Okay. So k-means is actually also a clustering algorithm that is fairly easy to explain. So your starting point is a bunch of data point. Let's say that you have n number of data point, and those data point can be high dimensional. So the lowercase d means what's the dimension. For example, let's say my data is a patient record. So each data point corresponding to a patient in my database, and then each dimension corresponding to some biometric associated with the patient. For example, the height, the weight, the blood pressure, and so on. So in k-means clustering, the idea is to find k number of cluster center by, and then once you find those centers, every single point is essentially assigned to those center based on their proximity. The idea is to find the k center that minimize a total cost. And then the cost is expressed here mathematically, right here, as what I highlighted. This is saying that, okay, I'm going to choose some L or k number of cluster center. And for every point assigned to a particular cluster center, I'm kind of looking at this distance to the cluster center, and I want to minimize the sum of squared distances across all possible choice of the cluster center. All right. And then this distance is called intra-cluster distance. So xi, which is one of those data point, is assigned to a particular cluster, and then their distance is what's called intra-cluster distance. Okay. So, and then this formulation really is measuring variance or coherence of the cluster. So if the cluster doesn't have too much variance, then this cost is lower. So there is one of those classic algorithms, which we're going to see right here, and it's an iterative algorithm for k-means. The starting point is, well, I'm going to provide my data, which is a point cloud, and then input k, which is specify how many cluster I want. And then starting point is to pick k centers. Well, the naive version, well, actually there's many versions, and depends on what your initialization, you might get a slightly different result. The typical version is to pick k random centers. So you start with k random centers, and then you iterate until convergence. The second version, instead of pick random initial center, you can pick what's called the farthest distance. So you start with a random point. That's your first center. And the next center you're going to choose is one that is furthest away from the current center. And then the third point you're going to choose is the one that is furthest away from the first two. So in this way, once you do this, you kind of have a more sort of distributed centers. And the idea is when you have those distributed centers, you kind of get a reasonable initialization of your algorithm. So, okay, so let's say I start with a very simple idea where I'm going to choose random k centers to start with. So those are called mu1 and mu_k. Those are the initial center. And I'm going to run the following until convergence. At every step of my iteration, I'm just going to assign every point to the closest center it's belong to. And once I complete that assignment, I'm going to recompute the center. And then the recomputed center is essentially all the points that is assigned to one center. They have all the same label, and you just compute the mean of all these points that become a new center. And you do this until convergence. So here is an illustration of how this works. Let's say my k is equal to 3. So the 3 color node are my initial center that I pick. Let's say I pick them randomly: red, green, and blue. Now, when I goes into this iteration, the first thing I do is to assign all the points to the nearest center. So now all the points which were originally gray now has a color, the color of its nearest center. So you see a rough division or partition of my data. So if this is partition, you have a red partition where all the square point now belongs to the red cluster. The green partition, all the green squares belongs to the green partition, and then the blue partition. This is one step of my iteration. And now I have done this assignment. I'm going to recompute what is the center among all the points that is red and all the points that is green and all the points that is blue. Of course, here, remember, I'm only going to look at my actual, in this case, my actual data set itself. So I can update the centroid as what I just drew here, and then reiterate this process. Once I update it, I now have a new center. Now then I have a new assignment. So I have a new assignment, and then this goes into the next iteration. Of course, this, let me show you animation now. And then this probably help you understand it even more. So let's say, and then, I give a lot of credit to this website which animate a number of clustering algorithm, how it works. So if you look at this, let's start, say, I'm going to choose a data point like this. And I'm going to, for the time being, I'm going to choose some, let's say I'm going to choose 3 initial center, and then let's say this is chosen randomly. And then as I am going through, remember each iteration, you just assign to the nearest center and recompute the center and so on. This is the first assignment. All the points are colored to the nearest center. Then I'm going to update the centroid and reassign the point. Okay. And then again, I'm going to update the centroid, do reassign. And then this kind of already converges because there's no more changes over the assignment. And that's when it's converged. All right. Now, of course, in this case, since I'm already here, let's say what is going to happen if I guess the round number of clusters. So let's say instead of having 3 clusters, I want 4 clusters. So at this stage, I am going to, let's do a restart actually. Let's say I'm going to start with 4. And then I'm going to, again, follow my step, reassign, assign, compute, assign, compute, assign, compute. So this is slowly converging to where I want it to be. And you can see one of the side effects of k-means clustering is that if you actually don't choose the right number of initial clusters, it might actually divide some of those more intuitive clusters into 2 or more clusters because of the number of clusters you want. Now let's look at what happened if I say I'm going to use the furthest point, and I'm going to use a different data set here. I'm going to add 1 centroid here, and now I'm using the furthest point as my strategy. So the next one is the one that is furthest away, and the next one is going to be furthest away, and next one, next one, next one. This is not going to converge very well, I can tell you right now, but let's just play this a little bit. So you can see from here, I am going to start, okay, initial assignment to the nearest point, update centroid, another assignment, update centroid, another assignment, update centroid. And you can see that as I keep going until convergence, it's for this particular data set, it's not something that works particularly well. Because ideally, if someone look at this data, they really want sort of the mouse to become one cluster, the eyeballs to become individual clusters, and then the silhouette of the face to be its own cluster. And k-means cannot do that, but dbScan will do better. So let's do one more example of k-means. So let's say I'm going to choose this example. And I am going to, as a user, going to specify my initial center. So I'm saying I want this one, I want this, I want this, and maybe a few on the silhouette outside. And if I do this, right, this is a user specified initial center. This is what it does until convergence. All right. Okay, so now let's get back to k-means. So that's this animation of how k-means runs. And then now let's look at sort of the runtime. Your n is number of data points here. Your k is number of cluster. D is the dimension. And I is the number of iteration until convergence. So for data that usually have well-defined clusters, the number of iterations is typically very small. So in practice, as what I have showed you, is actually quite fast when the k-means algorithm converge. But the problem is, it also depends very much on your initialization. So it only says that as I'm converge, it only find a local optimum, but not guaranteed to be a global optimum. Okay. So one thing people use k-means in practice is it run multiple times. Let's say my initialization is a random seeds. So they're going to run, say, each instance, they generate a new random initialization, the random k center at the beginning, and then run this, say, 10 times, and kind of look at what is the clustering result. Okay. And just by looking at the mathematical formulation here, in general, during each iteration of the algorithm, the total intra-cluster distance, which is this summation here, does not increase because it's going to try to minimize sum of squared distances. And then the total intra-cluster, as you increase the number of cluster you want, the total intra-cluster distance is going to also decrease as well. So the more k you choose, the more, how to say, concentrated or compact the clusters are typically. Now, one of the things that come up whenever you think about a cluster is evaluation. What I have showed you so far is I'm evaluation by what's called visual comparison, or in other words, I'm just eyeballing. Does this align with my intuition of the cluster? If yes, maybe it's a good clustering. But you have to be very careful when you visualize the data. Is typically the data itself. Of course, the one demo I showed is a two-dimensional data set. But when you have a high-dimensional data set, one typical mistake people make is when you take, say, a data set that is 100 dimension and project it onto the screen space, which is 2 dimension, and you see, oh, I see a cluster, right? Because there's a blob of things. And that is kind of a very dangerous claim, because it's very possible in the high dimensional space, those points are actually quite far away from each other, but they are only kind of sits on top of each other when they are projected into the low dimensional space. So if you are interested in this kind of things, there's a branch of data visualization, which is looking at when you do dimensionality reduction or projection of your high dimensional data to 2-dimensional space for inspection, you want to actually also look at what's called distortion, which is how much has I distorted the high dimensional space in my 2-dimensional visualization. All right, but that is for a different class. But right now, when you actually do not have ground truth, you kind of rely on intuition to say, well, okay, it looks like there's a few clusters. It looks good to me. That's part of my evaluation. The second one is, for example, for k-means, you can kind of looking at total intra-cluster distance. So you give me one type of clustering and another type of clustering, you can actually compute the intra-cluster distance, and you can say the one with a smaller distance is better. And then there's also silhouette analysis, which I'm not going to go into detail. Now, for the easier case, if we have ground truth label, meaning that I know the underlying data, which cluster they actually belong to, then there's a few evaluations. One is homogeneity metric. A clustering result satisfy homogeneity if all of its cluster contain only data points which are members of a single class. So in another way, your cluster does not have mixed label, right? So they are homogeneous. The second one is completeness, meaning that a cluster satisfies completeness if all the data points that are member of a given class are elements of the same cluster. So in other words, like the data with the same label are not distributed across different clusters. They all belongs to one cluster. The last one is called V measure. This is really combine both homogeneity property and completeness property together. It's kind of a normalized term. They take both. So the idea is, well, I want each cluster to be pure, but also I want each cluster to be complete. So it's sort of try to strike a balance. And the last one is sort of compute all three of them together. And the fifth one is what we have seen before is confusion matrix, which is to say, okay, you know, are the data in the cluster is supposed to be part of. Now, I'm going to take a very small detour about distance, because whenever you are talking about clustering, you need to compare data items. When you compare data item, you need to talk about similarities and dissimilarities. And for that, the typical idea is you need to have a distance to kind of measure how close two data points are. Of course, distance is not always required for clustering. If you just have a similarity measure, sometimes it works as well. But here we're just more talking about distances. So the classic one would be the Euclidean distance, which is the first formula. The next one is called Manhattan distance. And sometimes it's also called tax cap distance. So if you look at Euclidean distances, it says for any 2 points, I will look at the square distance in each dimension, sum them together and take the square root. But for Manhattan distance, it's actually only looking at, you know, for each dimension, what is the distance, absolute value distance in that absolute value difference in that dimension, sum them all together. It's also called tax cap distance, is because if you think about, say, the city of Manhattan is a grid, then if I want to go from A to B, assuming it's a grid, so then what I need to do is how far do I go along x-axis and how far do I go along the y-axis, and two of them add together become the distance I need to travel. So that's also why it's called Manhattan distance. It's sort of looking at essentially the distance along each dimension and add them together. Now, the next one is correlation. And correlation is actually a measure of similarity. It's actually not a distance by itself. So two items are more similar if they have a high similarity, meaning that if this measure is high, it corresponding to their distance to be low. Okay. So again, this is sort of the standard formulation for correlation between two data points, x bar, y bar, are think about them as sort of the mean. So you kind of compute the correlation between those two variables. The next one are called Jacquard distance, and it's come from what's called Jacquard similarity. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question on the correlation.
Yeah.
Is that like a Pearson or a Spearman?
I think this is Pearson. Okay. Yeah. And then sometimes you can take 1 minus correlation and become a distance. But usually when you take something, you transform something into something you want it to be a distance, you need to verify that it's Prashant, can you double check for me? Is this Pearson correlation? Yeah, thank you. Now, Jacquard distance is a measurement, or Jacquard similarity is a measurement of how similar two sets are. So you kind of say, you know, you have sets A and sets A and B. You take the size of the intersection over their union. So if A is exactly equal to B, then you know their intersection and union is of the same size. Then their similarity is 1. Then their distance is 0. Yeah. So okay. So my TA also confirmed that the correlation is Pearson correlation. Now, you have Jacquard similarity, again, is inversely related to distance. So you take 1 minus Jacquard similarity, you get a distance, right? So the higher two things, the more similar they are, you know, the similarity coefficient became higher, their distance became lower. So now, of course, when you have clustering, what distance do you choose, right? Because we are always so used to use Euclidean distances as a default distance measure, which works in a lot of scenarios. But sometimes maybe other distances works better. So when you have data that is normal distributed, and absolute difference matter, you can use Euclidean distance. When I say normal distributed, when you actually plot the distribution, you'll see this nice bell curve. Manhattan distance is that works well when the data set has some outliers. So you have most of your data set on your left, and you have a point that is far away. Correlation measure works well if the absolute value of the data point doesn't matter, but the correlation matters. For example, gene expression. So the idea is you want to look at whether the gene expression share a similar trend. The actual value of expression level doesn't really matter, okay? And GCAR index or GCAR distance is typically used for binary or categorical data set. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is called hierarchical clustering. And whenever people talk about hierarchical clustering, it's actually a class of techniques. It's not just a single clustering algorithm. So there's a few variation of this, and there is a top-down approach, and then there's a bottom-up approach. And the bottom-up approach is called agglomerative clustering. And the ones that for this bottom-up approach, the idea is you're going to kind of merge data. You first treat each data point as its own cluster, and you kind of merge the cluster and kind of build up. Versus divisive ones are start from the top, where you start splitting the data into clusters, and then splitting each individual partition into clusters. So you sort of have a top-down approach. But today we're going to talk about the first one, which is bottom-up. And you actually have probably seen this, what's called a dendrogram before, which shows how exactly my data emerge with one another. So in this particular case, I have a number of data points. Let's assume those data points are those blue circles on the right-hand side. And then they are, let's say for simplicity, they are just positioned in two-dimensional plane. And then the idea is I'm going to merge the clusters that is closest to each other first. So in this particular case, if you actually look at this structure, what I'm showing here is what's called the minimum spanning tree of those data points, which is basically looking at what is a tree structure that can contain, that can connect all data point that has the smallest total sum of distance. But another way to think about this is if you look at the dendrogram, it says A and B merge first. What happened is if you look at the data AB, those two data points at the beginning of my hierarchical clustering, I'm going to treat each data point as its own cluster. And then that's the lowest level of my dendrogram. And the next level I do is to say A and B are the closest one. So I'm going to merge A and B together. And that means that I'm going to draw an edge that connect A and B. The next one I'm going to see here is actually the data J and K. They are the second pair that is close to each other. So they also form their own cluster. They're corresponding to JK and then merge together. And the third pair is CD, which are right here. And then again, they are the third closest pair. Again, so they form into cluster. The next thing that is interesting, if I follow this order, is that the next one that is going to merge are the closest cluster. The cluster AB and the cluster CD, their distance is defined to be the smallest distance between pairwise distances of its element. So in this particular case, CD as a cluster and AB as a cluster, their distance is exactly the distance between B and D. And then that's the next shortest distance among all the clusters. And that's how those clusters merge together. So now you form a cluster with 4 elements and so on, okay? Oh, and by the way, this is what I have done here is single linkage clustering. Yes.
So if it was just A, B, and C, then for C to link to the A, B cluster, would it go straight down or would it have to go sideways a bit to either A or B?
What do you mean by that?
Like the shortest distance from the A, B cluster to C would be somewhere on the line between A and B. Could it do that, or would it have to go straight from the node A or from the node B to C?
Oh, yes. So, okay. So sorry to confuse you a little bit. The one I'm showing you right now is what's called a single linkage version. A single linkage version is sort of corresponding to the minimum spanning tree of the data point. The version that you are looking, so in a sense that when I'm drawing those edges, I am just showing you what is the distance, what is the shortest distance that is merging those clusters. What you are having in mind is instead of using single linkage, you are talking about something like a complete linkage, which is looking at sort of average distance between C and AB. So that is a different version. So don't look into this minimum spanning tree too much, because this is just one illustration of how the distances are related to how the clusters are merged into one another. There's not a very good way of visualizing complete linkage on the two-dimensional plane. That's why here I'm just showing the single linkage right now. Okay, so let me, actually, you're just 5 seconds ahead of me. So if I look at this, the ones I just described to you is called single linkage. Single linkage means that each time I am going to connect things, I'm going to connect the sort of the shortest distance between two clusters. So in other words, that, you know, if you're thinking about merging clusters, the metric you use are the minimum distance between a pair of clusters. So for two cluster, capital A and capital B, their distance is defined to be the minimum distance between them. So in this case, that's why when I have a cluster CD and a cluster AB, when you single linkage, the distance, the single linkage, or what's it called, the single linkage distance is distance dB, because those are the shortest pairwise distances between those two clusters. But I can also use what's called complete linkage, which is corresponding to the maximum distance. So in this case, for example, the cluster CD and cluster AB, their maximum pairwise distances is most likely between C and A. So if you're going to use the maximum linkage or complete linkage, and to use this same sort of visualization, then I'm going to connect C and A instead of connecting B and D. The last one is called average linkage. And this is what you had in mind, I think, is that you look at the average distance between all observations. So you want to merge two cluster AB. You kind of look at all pairwise distances between the elements, and you kind of sum them together and normalized by the size of A times size of B. So this is sort of normalization. So if you say, in your example, if I want to merge C with the cluster AB, then if I do this this average linkage, maybe the average pairwise distances between C and the elements A, C, and B is going to be the distance to each one of them summed together, normalized by the size. So it's probably somewhere in the middle. If I were going to try to connect with some edge that corresponded to that length, that would be how it looks like mentally. But it's pretty hard to actually visualize average linkage. You know, you just have a more intuitive understanding. You can always visualize it through a dendrogram, and that's what you can do. And the y, if you look at the y distance, is exactly the distance threshold where the clusters merge. You can also do things like centroid distance, which is basically if you give me two clusters, their distance is just the distance between their centroid. And then finally, you can have what's called word distance, which minimizes the total within cluster distance. And it's very similar to k-means. So for hierarchical clustering, because of those variations, you're going to see the variation of the clustering results. Then, of course, the next question is, which is the best clustering algorithm I should choose? The short answer for you is I don't have, you know, like a golden standard to tell you exactly how to do. Sometimes it's based on experiences, sometimes it's based on prior knowledge. It's very data dependent. You can use some of those evaluation metrics that we talked about right here to kind of evaluate which one is the best based on some quantitative evaluation. But let's look at this visually for now. This is my data. My data is sampled from two circles. If I use single linkage, I will get this really nice structure, which kind of respect the underlying shape really well. If I use average linkage, you get sort of like, you kind of divide the circles into two halves. And complete linkage have something similar, same thing with word linkage. If you have sort of this two moon example, of course, there's a lot of criticism over a lot of those, the first example, second example, because it's very hard to imagine you have real world data who has a shape of two moons. So this is a very artificial data set to kind of challenge the clustering algorithm. But this assumption, you have to be very careful to say, okay, I have a new clustering algorithm. It works really well on this 2-moon data set. Practitioners is not going to be happy because the 2-moon is not a realistic reflection of the true data distribution that will happen in the wild. But still, for single linkage, it does pretty well. It separates the 2-moon, and then the other ones kind of does reasonably well, but still have some noise. Now, the third data set actually looks very similar to what you would normally expect from real world data set. It turns out in this case, again, single linkage doesn't do really well for this distribution. It just says, okay, there's one cluster versus average linkage. And I would say, word linkage or to some degree complete linkage does reasonably well of separating the clusters. And you have also sort of this kind of sideways, again, you have different variation of success. And among all of them, they all work really well when your data has a very clear clustering structure, right? This is what I'm saying, the clusters are well separated from each other. All of them works pretty well. And, they kind of work kind of arbitrarily with sort of like data that don't really have a clustering structure, okay? So now let's get on to our actual coding, since we talk about those methods. The first one is, can we use what has already been provided from scikit-learn? As usual, you kind of import, the metrics. Remember, I need distances. And then, the cluster library. And in here, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to use average. Remember, there's average, single link, average linkage, single and single linkage, and so on. In here, I'm going to use average linkage. I'm going to use distance metric to be Euclidean, and the number of clusters to be 3. So remember, I'll say I have to be a little bit careful when I say, what do you mean by 3? When I have this dendrogram, this is a hierarchical clustering. When I say I want 3 cluster, it's really just take a line and cut this dendrogram at the level where there are 3 clusters below. So for example, in this case, if I want to get, say, 3 clusters, I will roughly choose a distance that is where my mouse is. This is a distance threshold I'm going to do in order to get 3 exact clusters. That's what I'm going to do. So when I'm actually calling the existing library and I'm going to plot it out, this is how it looks like if I were going to apply hierarchical clustering with 3 clusters, okay? But now, of course, because we're talking about hierarchical clustering, let's also plot a dendrogram. And then this is already provided to you. And let me see, I think I did here. Okay, so let's look at this particular scikit-learn library. It asks you how many clusters you want. Ask what sort of, style you want. There's average, single, complete, and word. The default is actually word, and so on. And then back here, okay. So here is an example. I'm just generated the sort of the array that corresponding to the linkage between the data point. But what I really want to show is how does this looks like in the data set we have. So this is sort of showing the dendrogram of the word-based word-based merging of data set based on the chosen metric. And then, of course, you can also do the plotting of the actual data point itself. So there's one thing here which you call this F cluster. This is corresponding. This is sort of the corresponding syntax. When you do this sort of F cluster, it's sort of it starts with a hierarchical clustering, and then you kind of find what's called flat cluster. That means I'm going to find a particular level and show the specific clustering at that level. Okay, so now is someone's favorite, some people's favorite, some most hated data set with the 2-moon data set. You can again do complete hierarchical clustering, use Euclidean, and I want 2 clusters. And then this is what you get, okay? And of course, if you change this to sort of the single linkage, you'll get better results as what we see before, like here, right? So the next thing is you can also add what's called connectivity constraint. Everything we have been doing so far is the data are kind of merged together based on their pairwise distances. But sometimes we can put additional constraint, meaning that I'm only going to merge data points if the data points are sort of k-nearest neighbor from one another. So in other words, is that I start with a data point and I compute what's called k-nearest neighbor graph. With what that boils down to is for every single point, you're going to choose k, and then you're going to connect to k of its nearest neighbors. And that's sort of the underlying structure that you are enforcing your cluster to be. So if a data point may be very close to another point, but that point has more than k-nearest neighbor already, then that data point wouldn't be part of the k-nearest neighbor graph, which means it would not necessarily be merged together. So if you actually do this specific constraint, you will get this one. Oh, it's just a warning. Okay. So what is happening between this versus this? All right. So in this particular case, when I'm doing the hierarchical clustering, I'm just saying that, okay, I'm just purely looking at pairwise distances and so on. And then, in that case, I am sort of my work. If I have a data point that is in one moon and another data point and another moon, they're both purple points because they are, by some thresholding, they're considered very close to each other. But when I enforce the k-nearest neighbor graph, those purple point that belongs to different moon, even though they are reasonably close to each other, but they do not belong to the same k-nearest neighbor graph, right? They're not connected to each other through the underlying graph structure. They're considered different. So in a way that's kind of enforce the connectivity underneath. And then you can see that if I have so connectivity force, meaning that I don't enforce k-nearest neighbor, I will have sort of clustering structure on the top row. But if I enforce, and then this one is not ideal, is because you see sort of like interactions between different rings of my data set. But in here, if I enforce connectivity, you will get a slightly improved results. Okay, but that's not, it's not. So enforcing connectivity will improve some of your results, but it's not guaranteed to always improve your clustering result. Okay. So now let's look at iris dataset. Remember, iris dataset is a dataset involving the iris flower, and it has 4 measurements. And in this particular case, it is 3 different species. So I'm going to try to do, so in this case, I'm going to first ignore the label and try to use hierarchical clustering. And in this case, I'm going to use Ward and Euclidean. And what I plotted here is if I were going to use the hierarchical clustering, what are the clustering results? And then when you say the V measure score, remember we have a quality, and this is a case where I can evaluate the quality of my clustering because I know the ground truth label. So I can kind of look at how well does my cluster from my algorithm matches their real labels. And then you see this is 0.77, not too bad. All right, and then this is how the cluster are distributed. And then you can compare it with the ground truth label. So of course, there's a little bit color shifting. So if you look at the upper left corner, the clustering does pretty well because it's actually corresponding to this particular cluster with true label. But on the lower right corner, it does reasonably well as well. Okay. So the next bit is, well, in this data set, it's 4 dimension, but I'm just projecting them into 2 dimensions. So whenever you see a pattern like this, where the labels are a little bit mixed, it doesn't really mean in the original high dimension, those data points are mixed, because it's totally possible. It's very possible that, I don't know why. Okay, it's very possible that you can have a high dimensional points here and high dimensional points here where their projection sits on top of each other. So they are separable in high dimensional space, but they're not separable when they're projected in the direction that you project onto. Does that make sense? So there's another way to kind of visualize sort of the clustering structure is what's called the cluster heat map. So the idea is it's visualize both the dendrogram and also the heat map to show what are the clustering structure. And then this is again part of the Seaborn library. So again, you kind of looking at the iris data set and you look at specifically regarding their species label. There's 3 species. And then the idea is to run what's called the cluster map for this data set, where the underlying clustering is average hierarchical clustering and using Euclidean metric and so on. And this is how it looks like. All right. So, okay, so this is, and it takes a little bit of time to getting used to. So on this leftmost picture is essentially the dendrogram of all the data. Each row is a corresponding data point. And each data point, remember, is a particular plant and it has 4 different measurements. And this dendrogram on the left-hand side shows, and it's trying to do as much as possible the sorting of the data points. So this is a data item 41, this is data point 33 and 43. Is sort of try to cluster them, try to kind of put them into those 3 species which correspond to the 3 cluster. They try to merge them as much as they can. And then the x-axis corresponding to the 4 dimension of each of those data point. And then the color kind of look at the variation of the actual value of those measurements in a fixed dimension. So if you look at each column of this heat map, it shows across all the data point what are sort of the distribution of the sepal lengths and so on. Okay. And they also kind of treating it by treating each column as sort of a data point, and then looking at the hierarchical structure among the dimensions. Okay, so now I have applied hierarchical clustering to this data. Let's look at what are sort of the measurements I can give. So in here, if remember, I have a few of the measurement. There's a homogeneity, completeness, and V measure, and those are the 3 measurements. They are all reasonably well. Now, if I want to choose what are the best parameter setting for this data set, I'm going to try a combination of hierarchical clustering methods. The word, the average, the complete, and then using Euclidean, using Manhattan distance, or use 3 clusters. The idea is I'm going to try a bunch of parameter combination for hierarchical clustering and choose the one that's behaved the best. It turns out the best one is actually model number 2, which is this one. This one I just highlighted. Why? Because across all the measurements, this is the one that has the best 3 measures with my quality measurement. Okay, so in this case, for this data set, if I use average clustering, use Euclidean distance, is sort of the best parameter combination or best model for this data set. Okay. All right, I'm going to give you a 5 minutes break, and then we're going to move on to DB scan. We're going to come back, or maybe 4 minutes, at 4:35.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
I have a question about the milestone. What are
Okay.
you looking for exactly for the milestone? Are you looking for a Jupyter notebook that shows that we've looked through the data and explored it, or do you just want like a written Word document that kind of explains what we've done so far?
Yeah, very good question. Let me actually bring that. So I'm just looking at what we have put in the syllabus. Ideally, I would like to see, or a short answer is, ideally, I want to see sort of a written report to say where you are. And if you have intermediate result, it would be nice to be able to show some intermediate results. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're not looking to like actually look at all the code that we've written so far.
Well, if you want to show that, that would be great. But if it's not sort of executable, it would be nice to get a sense of where you are in your implementation.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure what we wrote in the original thing, or we didn't. What's that? Yes. Yes, okay, perfect. Yes, my T remind me. Okay, so let me share my screen. We expect you have acquired, cleaned, and explored your data set. You should also explain in more detail what will go into your final analysis, explain deviations from initial project plan. You must please contact. Okay, so in this particular case, if you have, okay, so first of all, you have to have a report to tell us where you are in your current project, right? Where you are in terms of obtaining the data, cleaning the data, and exploring your data set, right? So the idea is to say, kind of state those details in your milestone. You know, have you acquired, cleaned your data? Where are you? You know, in some sense, when we look at your milestone report, if your report says, I'm still trying to acquire the data, then that is a big warning sign, right? And then what you haven't done, you should also explain in your report what is yet to be done. And then the most important, one of the important part why we need a milestone is, have you deviated from your original plan? Because for example, at the beginning, you say, I'm going to try to scrape from this API. And once you start using the API, you encounter a huge amount of issues with that particular website. Then you switch to a different website's API. Then that has to be stated if you have made changes to your initial proposal. And in that case, what I'm looking for is primarily a report. But if you have intermediate results that you can show, that would be great as well. And with the results, meaning that you can show figures, you can show plots, you can show analysis results. That's what I'm looking for in the report. If you have a complete Python notebook to show those intermediate results, that would be great. But you shouldn't just give us a piece of code without explanation what we're looking at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's important to have a report to explain where you are in your project, and any material you can provide to show us your intermediate results will be useful. All right.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I noticed yesterday that there was like an announcement on Canvas talking about like the project feedback forms, right? Will those have to be turned in along with the
Yes.
the update?
Yes. The milestone.
Okay.
So So, okay, so of course, this specific milestone thing is a very short one that what we're going to do is we're going to give you a more detailed explanation of the actual formatting and what we're looking for. Yes, the feedback from your peer feedback and peer feedback from your TA are going to be part of your milestone report. I believe actually, I think it's lecture, one of those earlier lectures, Professor Analito actually spent a few slides on the more detailed explanation for the milestone report. Prashant, do you remember? Is it lecture 16 or 14? Or some earlier lecture? I just don't remember the lecture names, but I know she has actually went into a little bit detail for the. Yes, there's 5 parts, but I will post that again on Canvas again.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so let's look at the second clustering, which is dbScan. dbScan stands for density-based spatial clustering of application with noise, but it's typically referred to dbScan. It's actually published in one of those large KDD conference, which stand for Knowledge Discovery and Data Mining Conference. It's actually also won a really big award for that paper. Is one of those more influential clustering algorithm out there. The high-level idea is fairly simple for dbScan. The idea is that you're just going to connect points when they're in the region of high density. That's a high-level picture. And then there's 2 parameters. Unfortunately, almost all the clustering algorithms you're going to use have some parameters. There's 2 parameters for dbScan. One is a measure of distance between any 2 points. It's epsilon. So think about epsilon as, in your mind, an epsilon ball. You want to look at a given data point and its neighborhood of radius epsilon, roughly speaking, and consider those points. Mean points means of how many points I need as a minimum to form a cluster. So if my mean points is say 5, then any sort of set of points that is like 4 or 3, you consider it to not to be a cluster. You kind of just treat them as outliers. So how does the algorithm work? You start by picking a random point, and then you look at the epsilon neighborhood of that point, which is all the points that is at least at most epsilon away. And if there are more than the threshold minimum number of points, you create a cluster, add all the points to this cluster. Okay. If not, they belong outliers. Now you look at another new point, which might be another random point, and you kind of look at its local neighborhood again, and you do this recursively until no more new points can be added. And then you terminate when you run out of points. So what is advantage of this? Number one, because it's only density based, it's just kind of merge cluster when they are of the same density. It's not constrained by the actual geometry. So if you actually, again, have 2 moons, you will easily recover those moons. If you have the happy face, you will easily recover the happy face, assuming they're set as a density requirement. So it works with pretty complicated shapes. And also it specifically deal with outliers. So if you have a little bit, have a cluster that is below the threshold of minimum points, it just says, there's not enough density for me to form a cluster. I'm just going to treat those points as outliers. And the biggest advantage of dbScan compared to k-means is in k-means, you need to provide k. In dbScan, it just runs until it finds whatever number of cluster it can find and terminate. So it does not require prior knowledge or prior guess of how many clusters are there. And again, let's look at the animation for dbScan, which is right here. Okay. So dbScan, let's do the smiley face. Okay. And remember, the idea is that you're just going to merge things that is dense enough. So this is how the clusters are constructed. And unfortunately, it's going to take a while. Okay. So what it does is that, this is one of the sort of advantage of it, because it's actually kind of, now it started a new cluster. because it started as another random point that doesn't have a cluster yet. And then now it starts the third new cluster and treating things as all right. So that's why it's terminated. It's pretty good compared to the k-means clustering algorithm, but you still see there's a little bit issues. Because it's density based, that's why the silhouette of the face, which supposedly to be a one single cluster, is now 3 clusters. The reason why is in area where my mouse is pointing, that area don't have enough sufficient sample. So it cannot sort of grow its current cluster. So it terminates right there. And the next time it starts, it's going to create a new cluster. So in a way that, yes, it's density based, but it's going to suffer from the situation where you don't have sort of a very uniform densely sampled data set. Okay, but it does pretty well with the eyeballs and with the mouse. Let's take our another one. You see what is happening? It's looking at, I need my cluster to be at least size 4. So a lot of those cluster with size 3 is ignored. They're considered outlier. But I also have roughly those cluster that is of size 5, but it does not satisfy my sort of in this epsilon threshold, the minimum number of points. So they are also considered sort of outliers. And let's do, that's not too exciting. So you're going to see this is another thing. And this is one of those data set. When you ask different people, they're going to see different things. You know, it's not as crazy as a psychological test where somebody see a butterfly and somebody see a human. This is a data set where some people will perceive this data set as having different clustering structure, right? So again, you can see the issue with dbScan is that it is going to suffer from uneven data sample. Some people might argue this data set is really a bunch of blobs with some noise, but because of the threshold you set for dbScan is actually going to return you like 3 or 4 clusters versus what intuition is. So, you know, it also has its own drawback as well. So for example, in this case, the white points are considered outliers because when dbScan restart over there, it's restart over there, and that's interesting. You say, why is this outlier? Well, why is this not assigned a cluster? It's because when it's this white point's turn, all its neighbors has already been assigned a cluster, right? So, and then you can't find more from there. Okay. Okay, so let's look at dbScan in skikit-learn. Again, it's already in there, and then this made blob is just make some synthetic data set for me, and then yes. Oh yes, thank you for the nice question. Yes, remember this dbScan also has an initialization. Depends on where you start, it's going to influence the output as well.
So whenever we are randomly taking new point,
yeah,
you will see point, it depends on the new point which we take.
Yes, it still very much depends on the initialization. So this is the same data set. Now I'm going to dbScan is going to give you slightly different results. Depends on, because by the time one cluster is formed, it's going to random choose another starting point. And where you start is going to influence how the cluster. See, this is now obviously give you different clusters. Right. So. There's a question online. Oh, yes. Thank you, guys. Thank you, TA. So TA just said that the guidelines for the project is posted in lecture 16. So if you see this is a particular reiteration. Oh, actually, to be fair, I think the underlying data also changed too, because the data must be resampled as well. Okay. So this is how dbScan works for the same data set as before. If you compare this against not single linkage, compare it against this hierarchical clustering with 3 clusters, it sort of doesn't treat things as outliers. It's just to say, let's merge to the nearest ones based on some sort of average distances. But in here, if you actually look at dbScan, it's actually going to treat some data point as outliers. So they don't have cluster. For example, those purple points, for example, those are sort of clusters. They are just by themselves. And you can actually look at, again, the quality of it. So in this particular case, dbScan actually gives 5 clusters. What are they? All the purples are outlines. And you have this red small cluster and this blue small cluster. And then you have those 3 large clusters. Okay. So in general, it works well for clusters that has uneven size. So again, I'm going to read blobs here. So in this particular case, I have 3 clusters coming out of dbScan, even though this cluster is much, much bigger than, say, the blue cluster, but still able to, as long as it satisfies the distance threshold and the density threshold, is actually fine. And also, like I said, it works well with complicated shape. So, it doesn't need special tweaking, doesn't need to have k-nearest neighbor constraint to recover the 2 cluster from the moon shape. All right. And remember, we have this data set, as we showed before, this sort of having those 3 point clouds that kind of parallel to each other. Again, in this particular case, it's going to find 3 pretty large clusters. And the purple ones are considered outliers. Okay. So now, well, it also it's going to perform less well for the iris data set. In this particular case, if you compare this to k-means, it actually couldn't tell apart things here because it's only density based. And if you're actually looking at the V measure, it's smaller than the one that is coming from hierarchical clustering. However, if your density varies quite a bit, this is when, so this example here is showing that when the size of the cluster are different, but they still satisfy some density requirement. But if the density requirement isn't met, or they have very, very different density, this is what's going to happen. For example, you have red cluster, yellow cluster, brown cluster, but then in this region, which is much, much sparser, it's basically going to divide this region into a lot of very small pieces of clusters because this underlying data has a varying density. Okay. So in some sense, what you have is it works really well for non-Gaussian shapes. It deals with outliers to some degree. And then the most important strength of dbScan is you don't have to try to estimate initially the number of clusters. The cons, of course, is that it's again sensitive to parameters, because if I adjust the epsilon parameter, which is the epsilon neighborhood, versus the minimal number of points, you're going to get different results. And especially when the underlying data sets has a different density. So there are many research. All here, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of papers using existing clustering algorithm. There's also tons of papers coming up with new clustering algorithms. For example, for k-means, one variation of k-means is to say, well, instead of try to sort of guess, or instead of having the user guess how many cluster they have, you can also kind of hide this under the rug, which means that the idea is I'm going to start with, say, 2 cluster, and I'm going to run the k equal to 2 for the k-mean. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to evaluate for each cluster what is the information content of that cluster. And then if I were going to split that cluster into 2 more clusters, what is the information content? If the information content increases, then I'm going to keep splitting. So it has a flavor of hierarchical clustering from top down, but it also has a flavor of k-means. If you're interested, this is called x-means algorithm. So it's sort of, in my opinion, is kind of taking the advantage of both k-mean as well as sort of hierarchical clustering to some degree. Again, it depends on how you initialize and how you converge. Okay, so I intentionally end my lecture early because I do want you to kind of work a little bit over the exercise right here, which you can work out among yourselves here. If you're in the classroom, you can form groups and kind of work on for the next 8 minutes. And for people who are online, I'm going to give you, I'm going to break you into working groups. I'm going to create break rooms. I'm going to create, oh, now people are dropping like flies. I'm going to create, let me create 2. Okay. And yeah, please join over your the breakout rooms, and yeah, please go ahead and join the different rooms. And I'm going to move people who are staying into one room. Okay, good. I'll be around if you have more questions, and if the people who are in the classroom want to like sit next to each other, or